You were taught to relax when someone smiles, to lean in when their voice softens, to assume warmth signals goodness. And so, when they spoke gently, you listened. When they looked sincere, you trusted. When they acted friendly, you dropped your guard. But you've been fooled more times than you can admit. Not by open threats, not by loud cruelty, but by softness, by faces that seemed safe, by words dipped in honey, but laced with motive. That's the wound you can't explain, because it didn't bleed, it didn't bruise, it just lingered. You assumed sincerity based on tone. You mistook behavior for truth, but Machiavelli knew better. He wrote that men deceive willingly, and that appearances matter more than intentions. He didn't say this to be cynical. He said it to be free. Because the world isn't run by those who are good. It's run by those who appear good while playing a deeper game. You weren't betrayed by monsters. You were betrayed by masks, by people who knew exactly how to play the role you needed them to. They studied your kindness, mirrored your openness, gave you just enough to be believable. And you gave them everything, not because they earned it, but because you believed the act. This is the lie that keeps you powerless, the belief that kindness is proof of character, that someone's tone can be trusted, that smiling eyes can't lie, but they can, and they do, every day. You weren't being foolish. You were being trained, conditioned to associate charm with safety, conditioned to believe that suspicion makes you bitter, that distrust makes you broken. But what if you were never supposed to be soft all the time? What if your sharpness was a survival instinct, not a flaw? They taught you to drop your weapons the moment affection appeared. But what if that's when you need them most? Because this is where most people lose the game, before it even begins. They confuse surface for substance. They let their hunger for connection override their need for caution. And in that split second of misplaced trust, they give their power away. Machiavelli warned, never outshine the master, never show your hand, never trust appearances. Not because people are inherently evil, but because people are inherently strategic. And you are still playing by emotional rules in a strategic world. You don't need to become cold, but you do need to become aware. Because the ones who will hurt you most are never the obvious threats. They're the ones who know how to smile while they study you, compliment you while they catalog you, get close to you, not to love you, but to understand how to move you. You want to outsmart the world? Then learn this. Not every smile is pure, not every soft voice is sincere, and not every hand reaching toward you comes in peace. Some come to learn your blueprint, and if you're still mistaking charm for character, then you're not ready to win. You're ready to be used. They can't destroy what they can't detect. That's the first rule. Not because your goal is to deceive, but because the moment they see your direction, they start plotting ways to bend it. People don't always sabotage you out of malice. Sometimes it's out of fear, out of envy, out of the simple desire to feel in control of something, even if that something is you. If they can see your next move, they'll prepare for it. If they can read your desires, they'll exploit them. So you have one job before all others: stay unreadable. Machiavelli understood this long before it became strategy in modern psychology. He didn't speak in the language of emotion. He spoke in the language of outcome. Hide your intentions, not because you're evil, but because transparency is a currency you can't afford to waste. The more they know, the more they'll interfere. The more they assume, the more they'll manipulate. So let them assume, but never confirm. You've been conditioned to overshare, to explain yourself, to make your motivations known in the name of honesty, clarity, decency. But how many times has your openness been used as ammunition? How many times have your truths been twisted into tools? There is no virtue in being easy to read. There is no reward for being emotionally accessible. to everyone. You think you're building trust, but you're building a blueprint, one they'll reference when it's time to strike. You need to become harder to follow. Say less. Speak in misdirection. Let your silence plant doubt. If they can't tell what you want, they can't guess what you fear. And if they can't read your fear, they can't use it. What if you stopped narrating your plans before they unfold? What if you stopped giving people the map to your mind every time you felt the need to be understood? They don't need to know what you're working on. They don't need to know how you feel. Let them feel your absence before they ever decode your presence. That's how power grows, not in exposure, but in restraint. They'll say you've changed, that you've become distant, cold, calculated. Let them. Those are the words of people who are losing access, people who once fed on your transparency, people who relied on your patterns to feel safe in your presence. When they no longer know what you want, they fear what you might do. That fear, that uncertainty, that's your shield. Machiavelli said that even the most virtuous must learn to walk in darkness, not because darkness is noble, but because light, too often, makes you a target. You want to outsmart anyone? Then stop handing them the playbook. Let them see your smile, but not your strategy. Let them hear your words, but not your intent. Because the moment they can no longer predict you, they can no longer control you. You thought being available made you valuable, that your presence was proof of your loyalty, your love, your strength. So you showed up. Again and again. Even when they didn't notice. Even when they didn't deserve it. You stayed present out of principle, because that's what you were taught. That consistency is virtue, that availability means care. But what if it doesn't? What if your constant presence is the very thing they've learned to overlook? Machiavelli understood something most never do. Power decays when it becomes predictable. Influence diminishes when it's always accessible. And the more familiar you are, the more forgettable you become. That's why the strongest move is often disappearance, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Absence teaches what presence cannot. It teaches value. It teaches weight. It teaches consequence. When you pull your attention away, they begin to see its worth. When you stop showing up uninvited, they start questioning why they ever assumed you would. Absence isn't emptiness. It's power compressed. It's silence with gravity. You think they'll forget you if you leave. But what if leaving is the only way they remember? The mind doesn't chase what it owns. It chases what it fears losing. And when you're always around, you become furniture, predictable, silent, easy. But when you vanish, when you become scarce, you become a question they can't answer. A gap they can't fill. A presence they can't replace. You were never meant to be constantly accessible. Your availability is not a virtue. It's a tool, and tools must be used with precision, not desperation. What if you stopped initiating? What if you stopped offering more than what's reciprocated? What if you became deliberate in your appearances, intentional with your absence? It's not about playing games. It's about refusing to be played. You've been afraid that stepping back means being forgotten. But Machiavelli would argue the opposite. People remember those who create tension, those who disrupt the rhythm, those who aren't afraid to vanish. When their value is taken for granted, let them wonder where you went. Let them sit in the echo of your silence. Let them feel the shift when the thing they once assumed would always be there suddenly isn't. Because when you're always present, they stop seeing you. But when you disappear at the height of your relevance, they begin to crave you. That craving, that absence, that's control. And that's the difference between being wanted and being used. So, withdraw. Not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Not out of pain, but out of power. Let your absence speak what your presence never could. You are not to be summoned. You are to be sought. You are not always here, And that is exactly why you matter. You've been living in someone else's version of you, performing in a story they wrote, framed by their expectations, their labels, their comfort. You thought you were being noble, letting them narrate who you are, adjusting your tone, shrinking your needs, making yourself easier to accept. But slowly, they began to define you, not by truth, by control. And you played along, because you thought being understood meant being safe. But Machiavelli knew, whoever controls the narrative controls the person. It's not about truth. It's about framing, about perception, about owning the version of reality that others are forced to respond to. And you were responding to a script that wasn't yours. You let them frame you as the overthinker, the dramatic one, too intense, too emotional, too much. And in defending yourself, you only reinforced the frame. Every protest became evidence. Every explanation, a plea. You weren't escaping the box. You were building it from the inside. They knew what they were doing, not always consciously, but instinctively. People don't need malice to manipulate. They just need comfort. And your clarity threatened theirs. Your truth disrupted their illusion. So they reframed you, turned your boundaries into selfishness, your silence into guilt, your detachment into betrayal. And you let it happen, because you were afraid of being misunderstood, because you still believed the myth that peace comes from being agreeable. But Machiavelli didn't teach peace. He taught power. And power doesn't come from being liked. It comes from being unshakable, especially when your image is distorted. You don't need to be seen correctly to act correctly. You don't need their validation to reclaim your voice. And you don't need to fix their misunderstanding. You need to redefine the frame. What happens when you stop defending yourself? When you stop justifying every choice? When you stop chasing their version of you and start creating your own? The shift is violent, not externally, internally. You lose the need to be believed. You stop performing for approval. You become dangerous, not because you attack, but because you no longer explain. You no longer flinch when they mislabel you. You simply stare through them, silent, unmoved, untouchable. That is the essence of dominance. Frame control. When they insult you and you don't react, the frame breaks. When they provoke you and you remain still, the illusion shatters. When they try to reduce you and you expand in silence, they begin to question what they thought they knew. You don't need to be loud. You need to be sovereign. Let them call you cold. Let them call you arrogant. Let them call you calculated. Those words are fireworks they throw to distract from the fact that they no longer control your story. Let them light the sky. You stay grounded. Because once you control the frame, the world doesn't get to define you. You define the world around you. You think waiting to react is strength. That being calm in the face of insult makes you evolved. That giving people room to correct themselves shows maturity. But what it actually shows, what it teaches, is that your boundaries are elastic, that your respect is negotiable, that your silence is a green light. And they test it, not once, but over and over, just to see how far they can go before you snap. And when you don't, they go further. Machiavelli understood this principle before psychology had a name for it. Tolerated disrespect grows. It doesn't disappear. It escalates. Because without immediate consequence, people assume permission. They assume your passivity is acceptance. And every time you let it slide, they learn they can climb higher on your spine. You've been taught to delay, to weigh your words, to wait for the right time. But power doesn't wait. Power moves precisely. It doesn't shout. It doesn't warn. It just enforces. Without drama, without emotion, without explanation. You thought responding with intensity made you petty, but indifference is the real weapon. A boundary enforced coldly, quietly, without reaction, scars deeper than any speech. It doesn't beg for understanding. It doesn't demand apology. It simply ends the game. You don't need to scream. You need to vanish. You need to stop explaining why what they did hurt you. You need to stop opening doors for reconciliation when what's needed is exile. Disrespect is not just an act, it's a test. A quiet question that asks, how much of yourself are you willing to lose to keep me comfortable? And your answer, whether spoken or swallowed, sets the tone. They'll pretend it was a joke. They'll say you misunderstood. But your body didn't misunderstand. Your intuition didn't flinch without reason. And the more you explain it away, the more fluent they become in the language of your compliance. Machiavelli said it plainly, never do your enemy a small injury, because if they survive, they will retaliate. And in your world, your enemy isn't always someone who declares war. Sometimes, it's the friend who's slowly turning your silence into their playground. So what happens if you don't wait this time? What happens if the moment they cross that line, you go still, not passive, but poised? Not because you're hurt, but because you're done. What if your boundary wasn't a discussion, but a wall they hit, suddenly and completely? Let them feel it. Let them feel the absence of your access. Let them feel the sharpness of your indifference. Not in rage, in detachment, not in volume, in absence. Because when you enforce a boundary without emotion, it confuses them. They're used to drama, to tears, to conversation. What they don't expect is silence that doesn't seek resolution. A door that closes and doesn't beg to be reopened. And that's the point. You don't teach people how to respect you by talking. You teach them by no longer allowing yourself to be in places where you must explain why you matter. They say they love you. They say they care. But they know exactly how to reach you. They know the timing, the tone, the soft entry points into your psyche. They don't need to overpower you. They just need to access you. And they've studied your patterns well. How you respond when they cry. How you soften when they shrink. How guilt becomes your leash. They don't need to cage you. You carry the leash yourself, tightened by your own empathy. You've confused emotional availability with emotional exposure. You've mistaken intimacy for openness. But Machiavelli would tell you, never show the full shape of your thoughts, even to those closest to you. Not because closeness is a sin, but because predictability is surrender. And once they can trace your rhythms, they don't need force. They just need familiarity. You made it too easy. You answered every question, explained every silence, justified every decision. You became transparent in the name of trust, and in doing so, you became vulnerable without discretion. Vulnerable not to love, but to manipulation. Because once they learn your script, they start directing the play, and you think it's compromise. But it's choreography. It's control wrapped in intimacy. Every time you responded the same way, they took note. Every time you forgave too quickly, they logged the delay between pain and reconciliation. You weren't in a relationship. You were a ritual, a pattern they learned to trigger. And now they don't fear your no because they know it comes with conditions. It comes with softness, with backpedaling, with room to re-enter. What if you became unreadable? What if your reaction wasn't the same pattern they've relied on? What if your silence didn't mean confusion, but finality? What if your kindness no longer bent into obedience? They wouldn't know what to do with you. They'd stumble, scramble, try every old tactic, jokes, tears, absence, affection. But when you become unreadable, they lose their map. And when they lose the map, they lose control. You think people want to know you deeply. But what many truly want is to know how to move you. To understand what makes you flinch. What makes you fold. And the more they know, the more they navigate you like terrain they've conquered. Machiavelli warned, never let others know the full extent of your mind. The mysterious are respected. The transparent are tested. You don't have to become cold, but you do have to become unpredictable. So stop being a manual they can flip through when they need to manage you. Start being a presence they have to consider, not a formula they can memorize. Let your detachment confuse them. Let your silence stretch longer. Let your reactions vary. Become unreadable, not to punish, but to protect. Because when they can, no longer guess your next move. They stop trying to play the game, and that's when you begin to lead. Not from visibility, but from mystery. Not by being loud, but by being untouchable. You've worn the word loyal like a badge, like proof of your character, like something sacred. You stayed long after they stopped earning your presence. You kept giving, forgiving, standing by. Because loyalty, they told you, was noble. Because walking away made you selfish. Because being faithful to someone else's chaos somehow meant you were good. But Machiavelli would have laughed at that illusion. Not because loyalty is worthless, but because loyalty without strategy is suicide. They didn't stay loyal to you. They stayed loyal to what you gave them. Your stability, your availability, your silence, the way you never questioned their inconsistency. And yet, you kept calling it love. You kept calling it duty. But what if it wasn't either? What if it was programming? What if it was fear? You were loyal to their potential, to their better moments, to the fragments they offered between betrayals. And every time they dropped you, you told yourself they were just lost, confused, healing. But Machiavelli said, loyalty that cannot be punished is not real. And that's what you forgot. You gave loyalty like a gift, expecting nothing in return. But all you taught them was that you'd stay, no matter how far they drifted. You think loyalty is virtue. But loyalty without standards is servitude. They watched you stay when you should have left. They watched you explain their absence to others. They watched you protect their name while they discarded yours. And they learned. They learned that your threshold was infinite, that your forgiveness had no expiration date, that your love came without consequence. That's not loyalty, that's access. And they used it well. You never made them earn you, never made them match your depth, never made them feel the cost of your absence. You just kept proving your worth, thinking they'd eventually see it. But Machiavelli knew. People do not value what is always given. They value what they fear losing. They value what makes them reach, what makes them rise. You thought walking away meant betrayal. But staying, despite the decay, was the true betrayal of yourself. So stop calling it loyalty when it's really fear of starting over. Stop calling it love when it's really addiction to familiarity. Stop pretending your endurance is proof of strength. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is withdraw what you once gave unconditionally. You are not an anchor. You are not a test of how much mistreatment someone can throw at you before you break. You are not loyal to dysfunction. You are loyal to your peace, your standards, your dignity. They want your loyalty? Make them earn it. And if they can't, let them feel what it's like to lose what they thought was permanent. Because the longer you stay loyal to those who dishonor you, the more you teach the world that you have no price, and you do. Your worth is not in how long you stay. It's in how quickly you walk when staying costs you your soul. You thought goodness would shield you, that if you were kind enough, soft enough, agreeable enough, the world would respond in kind. You believed that being easy to love meant being safe, that if you bent far enough, they'd stop pushing, that if you gave without resistance, they'd eventually stop taking. But they didn't. They took more, and more. And when there was nothing left to take, they asked for more anyway. You mistook your goodness for armor, but it wasn't armor, it was bait. Machiavelli didn't believe in moral purity. Not because he rejected ethics, but because he understood reality. He saw that in a world of predators, innocence is a signal. It tells people you won't fight back, that you'll seek to understand instead of resist, that you'll endure quietly, believing your suffering makes you righteous. But it doesn't. It just makes you easy to use. You stayed soft when you needed to sharpen. You smiled when you should have stared. You apologized for your discomfort, for your boundaries, for your expectations, as if wanting more meant being ungrateful. But the truth? You weren't ungrateful. You were shrinking. You were taught that being lovable meant being less. That's the myth. That being good is enough. That niceness is strength. That the quiet sufferer is the hero. But look around. Who holds power? Who shapes the room when they walk in? Who is heard, obeyed, respected? Not the one who avoids conflict. Not the one who dissolves for the comfort of others. It's the one who sets the tone, the one who doesn't flinch, the one who doesn't need to be liked to move. You're not here to be palatable. You're not here to be soft enough for everyone to handle. You're here to exist without apology. And if your presence makes others uncomfortable, let it. You've contorted yourself long enough trying to be easy. Being good didn't protect you. It made you predictable. And predictable people are controllable. They're safe to manipulate. Because they won't retaliate. They won't disrupt. They'll just stay. But staying isn't virtue when it means abandoning yourself. So what if you stopped trying to be good? Not evil, not cruel, just honest, just sovereign. What if you let go of the performance and stood in your truth, even if it shook the room? What if your new version of goodness included distance, included silence, included not showing up when they haven't earned your time because you've been taught that love is sacrifice, that to care is to give endlessly? But Machiavelli would tell you only a fool gives without cost, and only the unprepared think affection is protection. So stop hiding behind kindness. Stop shrinking behind good intentions. Stop believing your virtue will spare you from being used. This isn't about becoming bitter. It's about becoming real. Because until you stop weaponizing your own goodness against yourself, you will keep mistaking being stepped on for being strong, and you're not here to be walked over. You're here to rise, not kindly, not quietly, just completely. They wrote a role for you the moment you met them, not on paper, not with words, but through expectations, through glances, through silence. They cast you as the dependable one, the forgiver, the peacekeeper, the one who doesn't need much, the one who's always there, always ready, always bending. And you played the role. You wore the costume. You memorized the lines. Because you thought it was love. You thought it was connection. But it was control, dressed in familiarity. You didn't notice it at first. How you slowly stopped asking for what you needed. How your voice softened when it should have sharpened. How your opinions became negotiable. You told yourself you were compromising, but you weren't. You were disappearing, inch by inch, sacrificing pieces of yourself to keep the story intact, and they praised you for it, for your maturity, for your understanding, for your grace. They called you strong, but only because your silence made their life easier. They called you wise, but only because your restraint protected their comfort. You weren't admired. You were managed. Machiavelli understood this long before it became emotional strategy. He knew that people aren't loyal to truth. They're loyal to the version of you that serves their interest, the one that doesn't confront, the one that keeps the peace, the one that doesn't threaten the balance of their illusion. But what happens when you stop performing? What happens when you burn the script? They call you selfish, cold, changed. They accuse you of being distant, of not caring, of withholding. Because they can't access you the way they used to. Because you're no longer the predictable character in their play. You've stepped off the stage. And now they don't know what to do with the silence where your compliance used to be, and that's when you realize it was never about love. It was about control disguised as care. About rhythm disguised as respect. About keeping you in a version of yourself that made them feel powerful. You didn't lose them. You lost the illusion. And now you have a choice. Rewrite your role or keep dying in theirs. What if you started speaking before you were asked? What if you stopped softening the truth? What if you walked away without needing to be understood? The discomfort they feel when you shift is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you've stopped doing what kept them comfortable. Burn the script. Let them be confused. Let them feel the absence of your performance. You were never meant to be a mirror for someone else's narrative. You are not here to be manageable. You are not here to be palatable. You are here to be unedited, unframed, unrepeatable, because the moment you stop living through the image they need, you start living through the power you've buried. You walk into the room, and no one knows what you're thinking. No one can trace the direction of your gaze or the temperature of your silence. You don't explain yourself anymore. You don't soften your words to be more digestible. You don't offer versions of yourself based on what they can handle. You've become unreadable. And in a world that thrives on predictability, that's what makes you untouchable. This is where the transformation ends. Not in rage, not in revenge, but in sovereignty. They don't understand how you got here, how you became this still, this sharp, this quiet. They reach for the same levers that once moved you, and nothing happens. You've broken the pattern. You've severed the script. You don't respond to guilt. You don't yield to praise. You don't flinch at rejection. They used to know exactly which version of you would show up. Now they guess. And they guess wrong. Machiavelli said it simply. It's better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. But what he meant wasn't cruelty. It was presence. It was weight. It was that silent gravity that makes others choose their words more carefully, not because you threatened them, but because they can feel what you no longer give away. You don't chase. You don't beg. You don't perform. That's what rattles them. You've become immune to their tactics, their delay, their confusion, their passive aggression. You see it all. You just no longer participate. You no longer respond as expected. You've moved from being a character in their game to being the presence that bends the rules. You've discovered the deepest kind of power, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It just shifts the atmosphere. Your absence taught them what your presence never could. Your refusal to engage became your final boundary. And now, they speak about you differently. Not with familiarity, with caution. Because people don't fear what you say. They fear what they cannot read, what they cannot predict, what they can no longer control. You are no longer a mirror. You're a wall, a silence they can't scale. And from that silence, you speak louder than you ever did with words. This is your final evolution. Not louder, quieter, not more emotional, more precise. You've detached from the need to be seen, to be understood, to be liked. And in doing so, you've become powerful in the purest form. They can call it arrogance, they can call it ego. But the truth is, they're reacting to the version of you they can no longer access. The version of you that doesn't flinch, doesn't explain, doesn't shrink. You are sovereign now. You move by choice, not by reaction. You speak by design, not by habit. You walk not to be followed, but because you no longer need to wait. Let them feel it. Let them remember what it was like when they could reach you. And let that memory echo in the silence you leave behind. Because this is what happens when you reclaim the self. You become the question they cannot answer. The door they can no longer unlock. The storm that never raises its voice. Because it doesn't have to.